Hello and welcome to Negotiation for People Who Hate Negotiations. I have spent about a decade guiding people who hate negotiations through their first negotiation. And I have learned a lot in that process, and I'm excited to distill some of that knowledge and share it with you today. I find that one of the most common reasons people are hesitant to negotiate is because they feel like they have to become someone that they're not in order to engage in a negotiation. I think because of TVs and movies and all of those type of things, people have this concept of negotiation as a disagreement or a conflict or this like volatile situation where people are storming out of the room. And it doesn't have to be that way. And in fact, it shouldn't be that way 99% of the time. But what movies and TV do, especially when they're focused on these high powered men in business suits, they have made negotiation look like a battlefield. So you've got these like hard stares, people sliding papers across the desk, someone eventually storming out of the room. But in fact, the entire point of negotiation is to end in an agreement. And these volatile models of negotiation are actually, in my opinion, representing very poor and ineffective negotiation technique. By far, the fastest way to end up in an agreement at the end of your negotiation is actually to start an agreement at the beginning of your negotiation. Remain in agreement through the middle of your negotiation, and end agreement at the end of your negotiation. You actually never have to touch into disagreement at any point throughout your negotiation. I'll walk you through the process of how this works, but I think that's a really important point to start with. Point number one is that you don't have to start in disagreement. And I know I almost just said this, but I think it's so important that it deserves its own point here. You do not have to start in a disagreement in order to end up in an agreement. I'm going to say that one more time because I think it is the most important part of this entire lesson. So if you learn this, you'll already be ahead. You do not have to start in a disagreement in order to end up in an agreement. What you can do is you can start in the places where you already agree. You can move through other areas where you also agree. And then you can end up in a final agreement. And this is the fastest, most effective way to move through a negotiation. You'll notice I actually never said disagreement in any of those points. You're moving from your initial agreement to a further agreement to the final agreement. When you build from this shared ground, the process becomes smoother, faster, and less stressful. You're essentially creating cooperation instead of friction. And when you think about these like high-powered business suit guys in movies and TV, they are actually making their jobs much harder by creating all of this friction because not only have they likely destroyed that relationship for future negotiations, and they're going to be starting behind where they would have started if they just never spoke like that to each other. But they also are creating all of this friction that then has to be overcome in order to reach an agreement. If you just avoid creating all of that friction to begin with, the agreement at the end can come a lot more smoothly. My next point is about empathy. And I think this is another thing that people are maybe surprised to hear when they have in their brain this concept of these high-powered, high volatility negotiations, is that empathy is not only involved, but it is the most important thing in a negotiation. Empathy, as a definition, is what allows us to put ourselves in another person's shoes, to see something from their perspective. And when we're using empathy in a negotiation, we're using empathy to identify the levers, to understand the problem space and see what might be available to us, to understand the possibilities that might be available to us. The levers are the different factors in a negotiation. In movies and TV, there's usually, haven't watched that many negotiation movies, but like usually they're only talking about money, right? That's a single lever. They're optimizing a single lever and they are trying to optimize it all the way. So there's nothing left. But that's not real life. And in real life, a negotiation has often many possible levers, many different possibilities of what could happen at the end. It's not just more or less money, but it might be faster or shorter time, more or less additional perks, more or less free time or vacation if you're negotiating a job, something like that. If, let's say, for example, I'm buying a piece of jewelry and I'm negotiating with the jeweler. Of course, we can talk about the price of that jewelry, but we can also talk about the timeline. We can talk about the amount of customization in that piece of jewelry, how quickly it can be ready. Those are all levers in the negotiation. When I enter that negotiation to set myself up for success, I'm going to use casual conversation, a radical concept that they never do in the movies either, but just talking to the person and understanding from their perspective, what's the situation with this piece of jewelry? That's going to help me understand the levers using my empathy. I'm going to listen to them as they talk, understand what are the types of things they're talking about with this piece of jewelry. Is their timeline tight? Is it something they're really sad to see go? Whatever. There might be a lot of different things that they have going on in their side of things. And that's going to help me understand what the negotiation looks like from their perspective. As I'm going through this, the types of questions I want to sort of have answered in my head is things like, can they make this decision on their own? Or is there other people that we need to involve in this conversation? Are they under pressure in terms of timing, cost, or some other type of outcome? And these are the types of things that understanding them is going to help me find openings and possibilities where both sides of the negotiation can win. Because remember, our end goal is agreement. And so in order to create that agreement and create that cohesion, we're going to want to end up with an outcome that is mutually beneficial. Now that we have identified the levers and understood the possibility space in this negotiation, the next thing that remains to be done is understanding exactly what I want, knowing what you want out of this negotiation. And this actually requires some work. I think some people go into this thinking like, oh, I already know what I want, but actually you don't. You actually need to think through for all of the levers, what are the boundaries of what you would be okay with. For example, let's say you're buying a used car. You might have done some basic research on the Kelley Blue Book value of that used car, and you have a range of what you might be willing to pay in each different circumstance and some ideas of what you might offer. But maybe you didn't think about what is the timeline on which that car might be available to you. What if it needs some repairs ahead of time? What if you found another one that you liked better? Would you take this one for less if you found a different one you liked better? Or would you be willing to pay more for the one you like more? There's a lot of different possibilities to consider, and you really need to think deeply and be very honest with yourself about what it is that you want. The important thing to remember here is that negotiation is not about picking one lever. People typically pick money and optimizing that one single lever until there's nothing left. In that case, that would be like paying the minimum possible for a car. It's about creating a good deal, and a good deal can contain many factors. And sometimes those factors aren't purely financial, and oftentimes they aren't. For example, maybe you need a car quickly, and so speed could become super valuable to you, maybe more valuable to you than the price. Or maybe you found a cheaper car somewhere else, but you love this one more, so your enjoyment has some value too. And this is an important point too, because one thing we want to be aware of is that whenever we're entering a negotiation, it is never just that one thing that's on the table, like that one particular used car. It's this used car and all the other used cars that are available to us, right? It's never just about this one specific car. I think that's another place where people get trapped, is they think when we're negotiating about this car. And you are, but you have to consider it in the context of all the other used cars as well, because those are the other options for you within this problem space. Things like how much you like the car, how fast you need it, how much you're willing to pay, all of those are levers. And knowing how you value each one helps you move through the negotiation calmly and strategically, which is going to, again, help the negotiation move smoothly to agreement. So keeping it calm and strategic moves it through more smoothly. Now that we sort of have the ground laid, the next step is to get consent. This is the first real step of any negotiation, getting consent. And I think this is something that people are surprised to hear, but it's a super important step because getting consent creates the first agreement that you can then move forward from. And I actually learned this from a man who was flirting. He said, would it be okay if I flirt with you for a minute? And this was a bit revolutionary to me because it was such a small moment, but it showed confidence and intention, which made it very clear what was about to happen. It also established the first agreement in the interaction. And from there, we both knew we had both agreed to flirt for a minute. You can do the same thing in a negotiation by asking something like, are you open to hearing an offer? Is this negotiable? And the response to that will sometimes be no. And if it's no, you have, in fact, already finished the negotiation because you've ended in an agreement not to proceed or not to continue the negotiation. If they say yes, though, what has happened is you've established the first agreement that you can start from. You have agreed to negotiate. So now that you have consent to negotiate, you can state your position clearly. And this is where your pre-work of figuring out what it is that you want comes into play. What you do here is you let the other person know what you're thinking. Just clearly explain what you're considering and invite them to work with you to find a solution that fits. One important point here is that you want to stick to levers that are solvable, and not bring a ton of emotion into this, right? Because a lot of times the more emotion that comes into this, particularly like emotions like guilt or fear or other emotions that people find challenging, anger, things like that, you're going to create friction for yourself that you will need to resolve as you move toward the agreement phase. You think an example of what you don't want to do here is bring up like a sob story about medical bankruptcy or something like this. You want to stick to the facts and stick to your constraints. So you don't need to over explain. You can just say like, my budget is X dollars. You might say something like, here's what I'm thinking about. Maybe we can look together at what makes sense. And the goal here is not to continue to push until you get your way or create some guilt or create pressure on the other person. It's more about inviting the other person into a conversation about what the possibilities are. So if they can't move on one lever, for example, price, maybe they can move on another lever like faster delivery, better terms, or an extra perk that might make it more worthwhile. And the goal here is really just to hear them out about what's possible on their end. And next, so we want to see what fits after we've heard their perspective. So once we've heard what they can offer, we want to look back at our levers again and see where does it fit and where does it not fit. So if something doesn't work, you literally, you can just say so clearly and calmly. You can say something, my budget for this is X dollars, so this price doesn't fit for me. Or actually, I need this completed sooner, so that timeline doesn't work. Full stop. You don't need to explain any further than that. Just state your lever and let the other person come to the table and figure out what they can do about it, if anything. And another important thing to remember here, sometimes people get caught up on this as well because they feel like they are boxing themselves in by creating these constraints. And remember that you're in control in this negotiation of your own levers. So you set your levers and you can change them if you want to. Negotiation is not about being rigid. It's about finding alignment. Try to ensure that you're changing your position in response to new information rather than in response to pressure from the other person or because you're scared of sharing your authentic boundaries that you came up earlier. You can adjust. You have full freedom to adjust as long as those changes are comfortable for you and in alignment with your values. And this is the last step, the final step of the negotiation. After the conversation, you will arrive at a choice. Do you both want to move forward with a deal or not? And both answers can be success. A successful negotiation simply means ending in an agreement. That agreement might be, yes, let's do this, or no, this isn't a fit. Both are successful negotiations. If your levers are incompatible, you can't find any overlap where it works, the correct choice for both of you is to not move forward, to say, no, this isn't a fit, and try to figure out something else, right? This is still a successful negotiation because it ended in agreement. But then other times you'll discover overlap. You might find some creative solution that allows your levers to work together, and you might decide to move forward with the deal. And that is also success. They're both success. Negotiation is really all about arriving at an agreement. It's simply a conversation with the goal of finding that agreement. And you don't have to be pushy. You don't have to do any clever tactics. You don't have to become somebody that you're not. In fact, you will be a more powerful negotiator if you stick to who you are naturally and don't try to operate outside your comfort zone. Just to say that one more time, you don't have to be pushy to be powerful. You can be exactly who you are today and be incredibly successful at negotiations. This is going to be in an article that's on my Substack. I'll link to this video there. I'll link to the article here in the description. And thanks for following along.